So when you want to make inlay, you need some sort of recess. There are many ways to do that. One is to first sever the fibers with some sort of knife, so that then you can come in with a chisel and excavate that recess with little cuts like this, and then finish off the center with a router plane. I made the router plane in the last video, and today I'm going to make the knife. When you hold a knife like this, you can sort of consider it as a lever with the pivot point here where it rests against your hand, and force being applied out here by your fingertips. So in theory, if you were to move this pivot point, say twice as far back, or 5 times as far back, or 10 times as far back, you should get twice or 5 or 10 times as much force into the cut without doing any more work. A longer lever makes you stronger. And that is the idea behind the shoulder knife. This is a tool described by Roubo in L'Art du Menuisier, the same book that the Roubo workbench comes from. You hold the knife out here, maybe even with 2 hands, and your shoulder is up here. So you get all this leverage. And also, he doesn't really talk about it in the book, but I'm thinking that this curve allows you to control the knife by sort of rotating it. It makes sense in my head. I have never used a tool like this. I don't know if it works that way. It's going to be very interesting to find out, but I think that this curve is very important to the function of the knife. If you were to just put a long straight handle, you would get a lot of leverage, but probably not as much control. Would be interesting to make a straight knife to just as an experiment to see if that is true, but I'm going to stick to something close to what Roubo has drawn. For the blade, I bought the violin knife from Hock, a straight blade with bevel on both sides. You need that. It seems that the original shoulder knives were curved, and I don't know how much impact that would make, but I could not find a suitable blade like that. This was the closest I could find, so we'll see how it goes. The handle will be made from oak. These are some long, quite thin offcuts from the slab dining table. The first thing I need to do is to find the length I need for my handle. Alright, so I did not actually flatten these. It's kind of hard to see, but they're still very bent this way. But they are smooth enough that when clamped together, that's gonna give a good glue joint there. And that is all the shaping I'm going to do to these parts now. Everything else will happen after they are glued together. I think it's gonna be easier that way. What I need to do now is make a pocket for the blade. like so, flush with the surface, so that the other one can be glued on top and the blade is sandwiched in between. And I didn't do this too perfectly, too exactly, but one of these parts is about a blade thickness thicker than the other, so that I only need to carve out a pocket in one of the parts and then the blade will be centered, rather than making the parts equal thickness and having to make half the pocket in each of the parts. Just a little bit easier that way. So now I need to cut off the blade, because I want to put it in sort of parallel with the very end of that curve, which would make this part of the blade actually poke out of the handle. So I need to cut it off. Doesn't really matter super much, but we'll go something like that. And then I was thinking also about grinding it down a little bit. I think that's going to be a little bit better. So let's head out into the snow. So I got my recess cut there and a hole drilled through. I'm going to drill the hole in this piece after glue up, because then I can be sure that I get the holes aligned. And I forgot to mention earlier, but I had to cut off this little end here because I misread the grain direction, and this ended up being too weak. So it's a little bit shorter, but it should be fine. So it's time to glue up. I'm going to use polyurethane because I don't trust PVA glue in this temperature. It's not freezing in here, but it was freezing during night and it's still pretty cold. It's an expensive glue, but it's good to have as a backup when temperatures get low. I usually wear gloves when using polyurethane glue, and I think you should, but I've forgotten it today. There we go. I'm going to put the blade in the slot to prevent it from filling with squeezed out glue. So while the glue is drying, let's have a look at the physics. What is up with that enormously long handle? I think this type of lever is quite intuitive to most people. If we have an arm here, a lever, with a pivot point or a fulcrum in the middle, and a force at either end, we'll call this one the effort, that is us trying to push down, and this one the resistance, that is the rock that we're trying to lift, or the nail that we're trying to pull out of a board. If these arms are the same length, of course it takes 1 Newton of force here to move 1 Newton of load here. If that arm is shorter by half, it takes 1 Newton of effort to lift 2 newtons of resistance. And vice versa, if that is our resistance and we're putting effort here, we're gonna need 2 newton to lift a single newton of resistance. That is what is called mechanical advantage, and it's expressed as a ratio in this case because this arm is 1 unit and this arm is 2 units. The ratio here of mechanical advantage is 1 to 2. That is the first class lever, but this is not quite what our knife is doing. If you consider a knife held in a sort of pencil grip, it's resting right here. You're putting pressure here and you're trying to cut fibers there in front of the effort. So if we draw this in the same way, with that being our lever arm, that's our knife, the pivot is in the back. Then we put pressure close to the end, but not at the very end. It's somewhere in the middle. And the resistance is the wood fibers that we are trying to sever right at the tip of the knife blade there. And this is called a third class lever. There's also a second class lever, which a router plane can be an example of, but we'll not get into that. The way this works when we're calculating the ratio of mechanical advantage is this is our effort arm, and we want the ratio of this to that. And no matter how close our effort gets to the resistance, let's call that A, is always going to be smaller than B, right? So a third class lever is always going to give us less output force than we put in. But we can get as close as possible to a ratio of 1 to 1 by moving the effort force relatively closer to the resistance. Either by moving our finger closer to the point, but that gets rather uncomfortable. Instead, we accomplish the same thing by lengthening the lever arm and moving the pivot all the way up to our shoulder. With the fulcrum out there, you can see that these two are now much closer to each other in length. If the small knife gives us a ratio of mechanical advantage of, so we're putting pressure on it 2 centimeters from the point and it's pivoting maybe 12, let's call that a ratio of 5 to 6, right? We want A to B, and A is the distance from the fulcrum, that muscle there, to the fingertip, the effort, and B is the entire lever. So 12 minus 2 is 10, 10 twelfths is the same as 5 sixths. That's pretty close to 1. It's only 1/6 away from a 1 to 1 ratio, but we can get a lot closer. With the shoulder knife, I made it 80 centimeters long. If I use the same sort of grip and put pressure 2 centimeters away from the tip, which is probably not how you're meant to hold it quite, but let's say that, then B is 80 and A is 80 minus 2, 78, and we get a ratio of mechanical advantage of 78 to 80, 39 to 40. And that is a lot closer to 1 than 5 to 6. So almost all our effort is going into the resistance. We get, in colloquial speech, more leverage. So the handle is shaped, and I have continued the hole all the way through. The blade can be inserted there, and I will put a pin through it later, a removable pin, so I can pull the blade out and sharpen it more easily. What I want to do now is the same thing that is usually done on chisels, with this metal ring around the part of the handle where the shank goes in, which prevents the handle from splitting. I think that will be quite important with a knife like this, because when you're pressing this down, the blade will be trying to bend upward and split out the wood above it. So I have this little piece of copper pipe. I'm going to cut off a short length and shape this so that it can slip in place. And with that, I would say that this is ready for finish. I'm going to use shellac because it dries quickly, and it adds a little bit of, maybe not texture, but you know, it's not super smooth like a waxed surface. It has a little bit more grip, which I think would be quite nice on a tool like this. I used shellac on a couple of plain totes, and I really like using that one. It feels very good in the hands, so yeah, here we go. Alright, there we have it. It looks like it is supposed to look like, according to the book. The shellac made the copper a little bit more matte, and I like that. It looks a bit better next to the oak now, I think. I used just a couple of nuts and a piece of threaded rod for the pin, and I only had one washer, so the nut sort of dug into the wood on the other side. I'm going to replace that with something better at some point. This is just what I had right now, and I want to get this thing working. So what remains now, I guess, is to give it a try. So as you saw there, it is quite easy to cut a very straight line across the grain. It will easily cut a millimeter deep in a single pass, and for inlaying veneers that's usually all you need. I wasn't pressing very hard even. I think it could do 1.5 millimeters, maybe even 2 in a single cut, if you really put some force into it. It's a lot more difficult to control it when cutting with the grain. You probably saw me slightly veer off and try to correct that, and ended up with a wonky line. And what's even more difficult is cutting a curve. This is very tricky to steer. I've been trying to cut these sort of S-curves, just draw a random line and try to follow that. If you hear a lot of squeaking, that is from my shoes, because it seems that footwork is really important for this tool. You have to constantly change your position to be able to cut with it. I find that bracing my wrist against the vise is a good way to get a bit more control. But yeah, I need to do a lot more of this practice and learn to stop the cut at the right time as well. This is such a powerful tool, but it is also, because it's so powerful, it's so easy to ruin your work. I realize I'm not doing a great job of selling the tool. Like, why would you want something that is so difficult? But it is because it has so much potential. When I did my oak leaves inlay, probably what took the most time was to slowly, painstakingly knife around every contour and make little cuts and knife again and make little cuts and knife again and progress like 1/10 of a millimeter at a time. If you can get proficient with this, it's a single cut and it's done. That is an enormous time saver. There are, of course, many other ways of making marquetry and inlay. There's the double bevel technique. Cut it out with a router or a Dremel. You can use a CNC. But ever since I read about this method, it just seemed so interesting to me. It's such a simple tool, but there's something so intuitive about it. It feels like the most basic, down-to-earth way of doing it, and I would love to explore all the ways too, but this, at this point in time, just, it just feels like the thing that I want to learn. I'm excited about using this thing, and that's why I made it. I also think it looks super cool. I kind of want to have this on my tool wall. That's also a reason to make a tool, right? But yeah, it's definitely going to see a lot of use in the near future. For the rest of the year now I need to make a few Christmas gifts, and I'm not going to film those. They're just not super interesting builds. Next year I am going to start a very complicated piece of furniture for me. It will have a lot of curves, a lot of interesting angles. It's going to be made from some beautiful woods as well. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to that. Before I go, I have a video recommendation for you. A friend of mine recently finished a project he's been working on for a long time. It's a let's play of an old video game called Fallout. It's so well edited and really funny. Great voiceover, good memes. It's great. I don't know how much overlap there is between gamers and people interested in antique French marquetry tools. The Venn diagram of that is the overlap is probably quite slim, but in case you're interested in games, then check it out. It's a lot of fun. So yeah, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next year. Bye.